Baobab, Redwood, Neem.
Welcome to Baobab, Redwood, and Neem, an interview series by Peace Vigil which seeks to inspire actions to protect and promote peace. Today we'll be talking to veteran journalist John Dayal. John Dayal has been covering communal violence in India as a journalist since the 1970s. Among his many works, he has written 2 volumes on the Gujarat 2002 violence entitled The Untold and Retold Stories of the Hindutva Lab. If you enjoy these podcasts, please do leave a comment wherever you're listening. With that, please enjoy this interview with John Dayal. John Dayal, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So I thought we could begin. You've been doing this work for a long time. How did you first become interested? Did you train as a journalist, or what did you train as back when you were in school and university?
I've been doing it for a long time because I was born a long time ago, 73 years to be precise. In a way, I'm older than the Constitution of India and as old as independent India. But I can't say I've suffered the pangs of partition, or my family was in any way a victim of partition. So as a family, being Christians in a way and from South India, we haven't really been victims, or we have not shared the experiences that the Hindu and Muslim brothers would have shared in along the eastern and the western borders of what is now the political India and political Pakistan and Bangladesh. But partition did impinge on our lives in a big way because my father got posted to Kashmir. And there was also a time where a lot of services, including the defense services and services which were aligned with the army, like Survey of India and sappers, etc., of which my father was a part, got posted in extreme North India, partly because they were South Indians really. And here the army itself and all the services had been divided between India and Pakistan. But because of that very large number of South Indians in various services of the then British India and independent India got posted in the north and had to suffer not the pangs of partition, but the aftermath of partition. They came face to face with the hate that had divided and had become such targeted violence. Physical violence, social violence, how the large-scale migrations. And since we were posted in a way in Kashmir, we also got to then understand several other issues, the issue of being a micro-minority. I mean, how many South Indian Christians were you likely to find in Kashmir at the dawn of independence?
We think that Malayalam people seem to make their way all over the world. Were there not many?
Yeah, but the numbers would be 0 really, or 1 or 2. The families were not there to begin with, and then the families joined the husband or father. But let us say it was always in the backdrop was always there, and the reading material at home, because my father was an avid reader of literature of the Second World War, the history of the Second World War, which he had partly seen towards the very end. But he was quite interested in reading. And then because we went to schools in North India, and particularly when I joined school, I was in Shimla. We had moved out of Kashmir. And the schools that I went to were, now you could in hindsight call them very progressive schools. So we were shown almost compulsorily as part of our co-curricula documentaries emanating from the Second World War. And these were not documentaries that glamorized war. They were not military documentaries. They were documentaries, and at that time, a very large number of these documentaries had been released, which showed the impact of Nazis and fascism, which showed after the liberation of Europe, which showed what were Auschwitz and all the camps where the Nazis had kept Jews and Poles and Slavs and all other communities that they thought were inferior. And we could see even as 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, that the half-dead people or the living dead that were kept captive. And of course, later as a journalist, when I went to these areas and saw the camps myself, the mounds of false teeth and hair and old boots and all the other stuff that the Nazi camp commanders had taken off the prisoners who were then gassed and cremated. Suddenly a whole 65-year-old time jump took place in my mind, you could say that. So we were, and this is, I think, quite deliberate also as part of the Nehruvian inputs in education, that we were brought face to face with what these things meant, what war meant, what Nazism, fascism, these total inhuman political things and the military ramifications meant for common people, not just for soldiers, but for women and for young children like us, for children. Because among the dead were all children who were useless as ward labor, who were just mouths to feed. And the Nazis had a very short way of dealing with mouths to feed who were not in turn helping the Third Reich by way of labor. So they were just reduced to balls of grease and soap or whatever came out of those gas chamber. So it was there in the back of the mind. But there was nothing called human rights teaching those days, quite obviously. And later I sort of diverted for wrong reasons into the science stream. I mean, you had to score very high marks to get into the science stream. But in retrospect, I wish I had not got high marks and got to the science stream. And then you became very narrowly focused on science in general, and in my case, in physics in general. And physics is taught in the Delhi University and schools at the class 11 and 12 level, had very little time for social studies and for extra readings in literature or going back to my old readings. So all those readings were on the side in your private time. And your main focus was learning quantum physics and quantum mathematics. And I think that is a problem in how science is taught in India. I mean, why there are so very few people from science who come and who are pretty bright, who come and join these movements, very, very few. So for me, then the first reckoning with human rights was when I joined St. Stephen's College. And that was not human rights qua human rights, but human rights as social work in areas which were marginalized. So I was in the University Council of Social Service Leagues, and part of our work was going into the villages of North India. In our case, in our batch, going into the villages of Rajasthan. And at one stage, some of us youngsters, we built a road connecting our village with the nearest government road. It was about 1 kilometer, and with whatever hands and equipment we had, no earth-moving equipment, we built that road. But we saw many things in this village called Rampur. We saw, and this was 1965, quite a long time ago now. And we saw partition was over, but Rajasthan was not very deeply impacted by partition, although it borders Pakistan. But because there's still a large number of Muslims still resident in Rajasthan, even now, unlike, say, Haryana, where barring the area adjoining, there are hardly any Muslims anywhere else in Haryana. And ditto in Punjab, where there was a total, either a massacre, wiping out village upon village, or transportation to Pakistan, voluntarily or involuntarily, village upon village. So Rajasthan, but we saw in this village Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus living cheek by jowl, dressed alike, and for an untrained South Indian eye like mine, I could hardly make out the difference. All of them had the split beard, all of them had the same turban, the white turban, the same off-white clothes, they spoke the same language, and since we didn't go into the kitchens to eat, we didn't know what they cooked. So maybe the Muslim was eating beef and the Hindu was not eating beef, but maybe they were all eating the same goats and sheep. Maybe, I don't know. But there was no obvious hostility. And it was all hunky-dory there. But we were living in Delhi. And part of our social work was also in areas around Delhi University. We were involved in distant education, in educating young women and children of class 4 and economically weaker sections. And again, this is circa 65, 66. So we came to areas which were deeply impacted by communal violence of 1947-48, where there was not a single Muslim in Delhi areas. We're talking of Delhi University and adjoining areas. And
so in Delhi University, just for listeners who may not know, I mean, around that you have, say, Model Town, you have some of these places that were built specifically to house refugees who had come from what is today Pakistani Punjab.
Yeah, but that's Model Town. I'm talking of the old parts of the Delhi University area, which is Dina Ka Talab. The name is Urdu, with all the other villages that were there. Ghantagar, the Clock Tower, the Sabzi Mandi. These are heavily Muslim areas, And then
They
to
were by violence in 1948? Or
there was not a single Muslim left there. Male Muslim. The only Muslim women that could possibly be there were women that were normally what happened in Partition, who could not run and were captured, and in turn married the people who were the captors and possibly converted and brought up Hindu children who were Islamophobic. And this is something that one or two writers have studied, novelists, but not many people, and there are hardly any sociological studies on it. Dinaka Talao, Chandraval, where they were what are called OBCs, but very violent people. And that seems, so we were brought face to face with communalism. And the moment I became a journalist, which was in 69, Delhi had this whole series from 69 when I became a journalist to 74 when I got married, even on the day I was getting married. There was communal violence in Delhi's, all Delhi areas, including areas close to Delhi University, Sadar Bazaar and all of that. There was a rash of a violent incident every week and major clashes once a year, major clashes, curfews and shootouts.
So we're talking now about the late 1960s, early 1970s. Is that the right time period?
We're talking of areas from 1969. I got married in 74. So I'm just talking of that period, before the emergency. So which was in 75, so this is still 74, 69 to 74.
It's interesting.
There's a rash of
Yeah, because for many of us who have sort of come of political awareness in a later generation, we might think of 1989 as a starting point for communal violence, or 1992, or yes, of course, 1947. But the perception of the 60s and 70s is that it didn't really come up so often. But you're saying that it was happening every year, or maybe even more often.
The violence in Ahmedabad in 1969 has never been exceeded, even in 2002. In sheer numbers of people killed, impunity, involvement, and it was not the BJP. So it's important when you're studying the political forces involved in polarization and the ground soldiers taking part in violence. Whoever is in power doesn't really matter, because this whole broad stream, this streak up and down the Indian spine existed. So 69 was a huge violence in Ahmedabad. Everybody knows of it. Delhi, the violence in 74 was massive. In many ways, what came to be exceeded only in 1984 when the anti-Sikh violence took place. And 74, anti-Muslim violence has not been exceeded even by the Eastern Delhi violence last year in the Citizens Act.
So you as a young man, as a student, and then as someone who's just beginning to find a career, you're obviously an avid reader of newspapers. So you're aware of all these things. You're following what's going on. At what point do you decide to shift your career away from physics and become more, actually start focusing on journalism?
As I was saying, very soon after I became a journalist, I had the good fortune, after spending a few months in two organizations, a few months each, I joined the Patriot, which was at that time and till its death, the only really left-wing English daily newspaper in the country, with brilliant leaders as its editors and as my mentors and seniors, people who had participated in the freedom struggle. So our link with the freedom struggle was first-hand. And very soon in my career as a reporter, I decided that it is impossible for a human being to be a neutral reporter. You are embedded, as now you get as a reporter embedded in the American army, never on the Palestinian army, where I was once embedded, but you get embedded on the side of the marginalized, of the victim, of the poor, of the Muslim, of the Sikh, of the woman. And you then look at whatever is happening, not by, I've never in my life interviewed a rapist. I've never asked a rapist, why do you rape? I know. But I am concerned when I go to a court and I'm witness to a law case with the judge and the lawyer are cross-examining the woman victim and then raping her again in a court. So and my blood boils. My reporting, even in a court case then, was from the woman's perspective. And there were, I can't say every reporter was like me, but we were a handful. So there was a mutual support.
Yeah.
And all of them...
Before we continue on the line of journalism, so you made a deliberate choice at some point to shift from being a physicist. I mean, at that point, you would have been, you had high marks in school, you were going to university for science, doing other things as well. But was there a moment when you said, okay, this path is not for me, I'm going to focus on something else?
Yeah, that comes up, I think, in your, certainly by the second year in your college of a 3.5-year course, you realize that you have made a mistake by joining this. And you discover, in my case, that maybe you don't have enough brains to be a path-breaking scientist, and that there's no point just to be a student of science or a graduate of science if you don't want to take up astrophysics as a long-term career, as a lifelong career. So you start looking for options, and I took courses in journalism, and the first opportunity I jumped ship and became a very low-grade, bottom-rung journalist, and then steadily climbed all the way up and beyond.
Fantastic.
It was a deliberate decision, but it is not that because you failed as a scientist, you come here. At some stage, you make a choice, really.
No, for sure. And just to I mean, for our listeners will know this, but many of the people we've interviewed on this channel and elsewhere actually came from physics, surprisingly. So Dr. Tripathi is another person who's come from physics, Dr. Bhagat in the US as well. There's someone I've interviewed on my channel called Sonali Kolhatkar, who is the granddaughter of someone called Y.S. Kolhatkar, who you may know. And she also studied as an astrophysicist and has been a reporter, a leftist reporter, now for some 20 years. So it's not an unheard of, not common, but not unheard of career path that you ended up taking. So you started as a low-grade journalist. Did you have the chance to...
No, I mean, not low grade or low quality. But when you're starting as a journalist and you've not been to Oxford, you join at grade 1.
Of course.
You don't join as an assistant editor. And that is a problem with some of my seniors, because they came from Oxford and Cambridge or from Harvard, and they joined as assistant editors. They started their professional work writing commentaries and didn't do a day's work of grassroots reporting. So
Sure.
in that context, I was saying. So I started as a grassroots journalist, where I was correcting the copy because I had a strong language background also. I was improving or editing the copy of others. And then I started reporting myself, really.
Yeah, for sure. And in those early... So people who have actually done what I would describe as real journalist work, in their youth especially. So that's going from village to village, that's going from city to city, finding stories, reporting on things that other people in the office would find difficult. What are some of the key lessons you learned from that period in your career? There
are no stories if you're reporting from the part, if you're riding a government bus or going in a police jeep or a military armored vehicle. You have to really be with the people. You have to ask for a glass of water, not accept a glass of water that is given, ask for a glass of water. Because immediately that will put you in touch and form a chord with the people. They will know that you don't bother about caste, about religion, about education, even about hygiene, that you're willing to drink the water that they will give you. And then they will accept you as one and talk to you. You learn that. The second lesson is slightly more bitter. You learn when you talk to a cross-section of people, when you're doing quantitative work apart from what you've just seen, you also discover everybody is speaking the truth, but nobody is speaking the whole truth, which is more than a summation of all the small stories. But that does not mean that the small stories are not important in themselves. They help build. That also puts the government take, the official take, the corporate communicators take, the company spokesperson's take into a different perspective. They're not lying to you entirely. They're twisting the truth. They're giving you the half truth. They are forming their version of the facts by not totally giving you the full facts. And then you discover that when the common man, the raped woman, the Muslim in a village, the Christian in another village, the tribal, and you know they are not telling you the whole truth, it is because of their ignorance, because they don't know the full data. They've not traveled beyond the district. But when the authorities, whether they are the district magistrate or the government of India or the Supreme Court, when they speak, they have the wherewithal to have a larger look. And yet they choose to focus on the smaller part.
Yeah.
So the error is a deliberately introduced error. It has to be seen as that, pointed out as that, and reported as that.
No, 100%.
They're trying to, in speaking the truth, they're trying to hide very much. The victim speaks unlimited truth, but that's all he knows.
I understand. At this young point, at this sort of, you're still very young in your career, but you've already developed an analysis of state institutions, which is somehow bifurcated in the sense that you grew up at a time when, you know, the state and sort of the Nehruvian tradition, you've already described the schools you went to as progressive and so on. There was an element in there, the Constitution was young and so on. There was an element in there that everyone felt a kind of almost patriotism, but idealism almost in those days. No, I mean, this is maybe I'm projecting onto it. So there's one point that, you know, the government can do great things, look at this great constitution and so on. And then there's another thing that when you actually look at what governments are doing at both the state level and the national level, you find the same kind of corruption, self-servingness, and even sometimes facilitating the conditions within which riots can happen. You see that in very grotesque kind of ways, yeah?
Yeah. So you mentioned patriotism and nationalism. Let me tell you, let us say even till the mid-70s, before the Sikh uprisings started taking place, and other than the insurrections in Northeast India, in NEFA, what was called Northeast Frontier Agency, which is now Arunachal, and those insurgencies, and for a very short while, the language issue in Tamil Nadu, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, whatever, the concept of not being a nationalist didn't arise. Nobody said, I'm a nationalist. Nobody said, I'm a patriot. There was no other way. They were 100% patriots, 100% nationalists. You oppose the government, but you are not anti-constitutional, you are not anti-state at that time. You know? So I think that this is a later, early 80s. After that, then it started picking up, and when the BJP RSS started putting up.
Is there no contradiction in being, you know, pro-constitution and anti-state? I mean, is that not a...
No, you could be anti-constitution also. No, what I'm saying is, other than the insurrections in the Northeast, which had not accepted fully, they not accepted. They said we were never part of British India. They said that. And when Hindi was sought to be imposed, supported by the President of India on Tamils, they rebelled. They said, who gave you the authority to change your mother tongue? We never authorized you to have Hindi as a national. So apart from these two areas, currently everybody who's a dissenter is said to be anti-patriotic. Is said to be anti-national, supposed to be against the whole edifice of which constitutions or whatever they like or not, everything that you hold as a nation state, which was not there then.
I'm with you. I'm with you. So I
So,
still sense a kind of a. I mean, we don't need to delve on it further, but let's go back to just talk about. So we've talked about communal violence in the 60s and 70s, and what do you think was behind some of that communal violence? I know you in a little bit we'll talk about the later communal violence in Gujarat in the 1990s, and then of course in 2002, and you've studied that
yeah,
in a lot of detail. But how those other incidents you've mentioned, 1969 in Ahmedabad, 1974 in Delhi, what was going on at that
no,
time?
1969, I was much too young a journalist to go and cover it. But after 70, I covered every violent act in great detail. And the fact that I was not a Muslim and not a Hindu, the fact that because of my father's background, and the education I'd had, I had knowledge of how state functions, how armies function, how police functions. I had the language and the social, if I may use a term, to be able to talk to officers in their own lingo, to be able to face the police and go in case of curfew, to talk to the army officers, and thereby go into the alleys and the smaller the roads, go into houses which were sealed because of the curfew, and talk to people, talk to Muslim women and Muslim men in their home in the middle of a city which was closed by curfew, with the army guarding them, and also go and talk to the Hindu across the divide, and if not be accepted by both of them, not be looked with too much of suspicion now. Even now, today, 2021, my daughter is a senior journalist herself. Even now, if you go into an area and if you've got a Muslim name, the Hindu villager will almost question you because of your religion. You may be an atheist. Your wife may be a Hindu. But because your name is Muhammad something, he will say, but aap to Muslim hai. You are a Muslim. Will you report my situation honestly? Are you yourself close to the terrorist, to Pakistan, to wherever? This happens. And if you are a Hindu and you go to a Muslim mohalla, and some youngster is going to say, but Mr. Sharma, you're not going to report us fairly. You'll write what you want to write. So it's natural. But I'm not saying, I'm not making a case for more journalists to come, be either atheists or be Christians, But the fact of who I was allowed me insights which would not be open to other of my batchmates in journalism. Of that, I'm very clear. Because I can see their own growth, see their writings, how they grew up, and are now my contemporaries past 70, and I know how their mind has changed. So that did give us great insight. It also gave us great insight into the mind of the police, the Indian police, and including the Indian Army. And over a period of time, I've had many occasions to really touch them. And say in case of state impunity, the Indian Army has often been an arbiter of life and death in communal violence, of peace, whether it's Bhiwandi, elsewhere, etc. But even as the soldier and the officer is maintaining that peace, he will, when you sit down with him in the evening, in the vocabulary he uses, tell you where his heart lies.
For sure.
And that can mean whether he's going to allow milk to come into a Muslim area which is sealed because of a curfew and where the young babies have no milk to drink.
Yeah.
Or he will not allow it. Or the curfew will be looser, less strict and stringent in a Hindu area. And it has ramifications, And ultimately, of course, at its most crass, it is the police siding with the aggressor, had happened in the case of Sikhs in 84, and has repeatedly occurred, and I've seen it later, with even something as small, you can call it, although to the victim it was death, or what are now called, where you catch a Muslim and say you're carrying beef and you lynch him. cow protection lynch mobs, and how the police come in support, and how the police come and file cases against the widow, against the father of the dead man, against his brothers.
Yeah.
So you can see how deep it goes, empathy and elsewhere in the world also you see it when
Yeah, I have
armies go into action. Yeah.
I mean, there's a story. It's not 20 years or so ago. I was myself much younger, not a journalist, but a worker for NGOs, and I was in a place called Chiang Mai in Thailand. And I used to, I was the head of a small organization, and we would have, we'd have our conferences there or whatever. And I would try and schedule it so I didn't have to travel so much, so there would be 2 or 3 conferences there. So it was a night between the conferences. I was the only one attending both conferences. So I stayed overnight somewhere. And I just, in Thailand, they sell beer in like these big bottles, yeah? So I had my bottle of beer, I had a glass from it, and I gave the rest to the next table. I didn't care who was at the next table. I just said, please, take this. Because I don't want to drink it, and you can finish it. Turns out it was the head of the Chiang Mai police. And turns out that this guy, he said, come and sit and have a drink or whatever. He was very, he liked that I gave him some alcohol. So I sat with him, and he went on for 35 minutes about how these dirty, filthy Burmese people are coming here and destroying Thailand and so on. Now, he didn't know it, but the next day I'm having a conference with the Burmese leaders in exile in Chiang Mai. And this is before the days of mobile phones and so on, but I'm taking mental notes and I write down exactly what this guy says. Because the bias was very obvious, right? There's someone in his public statements, he's saying, there's many issues to consider, and, this rioting, it's faults on both sides, even though everyone knows which side is a refugee and which side is the powerful community. But in his private talk, it's very clear that he's taking sides in this conflict.
Yeah, I think he has to find wells of strength, sources of strength, to even try to be neutral, Yeah. So,
but it's also a question of, do they have any interest in being neutral is also part of the question, right?
Yeah.
Is it their role?
But to a young reporter, and even a senior reporter, by the time you're 30, you're a senior reporter in charge of whole rooms of reporters, you get to understand how to sift truth from chaff, how to find that small little kernel of reality and then build your story around it. And you know what crap to throw away, to hive off.
Yeah. So what is the truth? So when we look at some of these riots, I mean, there's always a powerful community and a less powerful community. That is a trend, right? There is always a state that is siding with the powerful community. That is also another trend. What else can we say about these places? I mean, in Gujarat, it's now ended up as complete apartheid, where even the richest Muslim can't buy a house in certain parts of the city. I mean, yeah.
Also in Delhi, large areas of Delhi, yeah. Yeah, the country is that way, you can say, it's homogeneous. In most areas, we are coming now to a very involuntary ghettoization. People are selling off their apartments at a lower price to come and live with their fellow Muslims and buy smaller houses at higher costs, because there's only so much land to go around, and the economics of migration takes control of the situation. You double lose. You lose in selling your old apartment in a Hindu area, and you lose buying a smaller apartment at double the cost in a Muslim area. So the ghettos are becoming very expensive.
So for you, as someone who you grew up in North India, but you're ethnically and linguistically, maybe you have ties to Kerala. So in that way, you can call yourself still a kind of an
ties with Kerala and Andhra.
With Kerala and with Andhra Pradesh. So you can call yourself sort of an outsider in these cities that you've lived or that you've visited?
No, absolutely. I was a double outsider. Yeah. I was an ethnic outsider, ethnic linguistic outsider, although I knew Hindi. But even now my Hindi is different from everybody else's Hindi, in that at some stage it doesn't support me very much. I was in fact a triple outsider, you could say. I was an ethnic outsider, a linguistic outsider, a religious outsider, And I'm a very dark person. And North India is very racist. It's like how it is in terms of skin color. So we were dark-skinned Christians, speaking straight languages at home, eating rice in winter.
Yeah.
So
No, for sure. But then in that context, you're going to these cities. You're living in Delhi. You've lived in Delhi, I think, now for most of your life. But you're also
from 1963.
1963. So, but you're also visiting these places. You mentioned Shimla. You've mentioned Ahmedabad.
Yeah, I grew up there. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're visiting places that, and often you're visiting after there's been a trauma, after there has been some
Yeah.
kind of riot, after there's been some kind of problem. And so I think that gives you a unique perspective into that trauma. So what do you see? I mean, one thing that I noticed when I visited these places after the riots, that nobody wants to say anything. Like there's lots of, the victims are there and they're pretty plainly obvious, and they don't want to speak for obvious reasons. They've just been traumatized. But even the people who
They don't want to talk to you if they see you as somebody who's superficial, who's supercilious, who is a paradropper, will come in, take their soundbite, and go and couldn't care less. And they won't know how the soundbite is to be used, how the photograph will be used, how will it be contextualized. They look at you with great suspicion. But let me tell you this, they want to talk. They want to talk. If you sit down with them, listen to the story, they will tell you in great detail. And they will tell you years later, with the same photographic memory of the past and the same detail. You can check over the years when you go and talk to the same people. So I would not buy that nobody wants to talk, that they don't just lips are closed. Do you have the time and the patience and the empathy? Journalism has very little empathy. The salaried journalist has very little empathy. He's not a novelist. He's not Miss Roy, who would like to understand and has the luxury of time to let it mature and then put it on paper. As somebody used to file it in half an hour, he'd rather take the security of going with the police, behind the police. Very few Indian journalists want to go cross the line. You will always see them taking a photograph from behind the water cannon. Although that's a very good place to take a photograph of the victims facing the thing. But you don't face the challenge. Have you ever been with the victim, facing the tear gas, facing the water cannon? How many photographs are there, unless it's posed, as in Palestine, Israel, Beirut, Afghanistan, where you ask this man, just show me the barrel of the gun for a second while I photograph it, and then turn it and give a 30-second burst of fire, and I'll photograph you and send it away. How often has an Indian newspaper carried a photograph showing the puff of smoke from the firearm wielded by the police? I challenge you.
That's a very interesting point, and it raises an interesting question, because, of course, in your career, from that young time, things may have been bad in 1969, things may have been bad in 1974, but I think you would agree that the whole tone of the country has become more communal, has become more polarized since then, and especially since 2014. I mean, this is not something that's hidden, right? In that context, to what extent is the whole profession, the journalistic profession, complicit in this polarization?
The three factors that come in here. No, apart from the fact that communal violence is only the second last stage of, let us say, a 5 or a 6 stage phenomena. Begins with how the equilibrium is shaken, economic issues, whatever issues, political issues, partition. And then how communal tension is developed. It is not violent yet, but what is now called polarization. the deliberate attempt to separate the two entities, widen the chasm by introducing false information, fake news, economic impetus, posting policemen of your own caste, depriving the other community of something, changing the laws. You quite deliberately, in cold blood, widen the difference. Then you come to a stage where you bring the two communities in a state of confrontation, for whatever reason, by triggering a false alarm, by an abduction, by a rape, by a small skirmish in a village. The trigger itself, does it come naturally? Are you doing it deliberately? And of recent vintage, you're doing it deliberately. And then comes the physical violence, eventually how it is controlled, the post-violence situation, separate. And then lastly, the justice. Is the culprit punished? Is it not culprit? So now the whole spectrum is split into its individual colors, and each has then to be looked at. And this is where the journalist himself, his media, deliberately, by design or coincidentally, becomes a participant in the violence and a participant in the polarization, in the communalization. Social media, TV, the fact that TV is owned by people who find themselves close to the government, all of them lead to news itself becoming a factor in accentuating, if not triggering, the violence. If they become a factor in ensuring the justice will be warped or will be never given. Simple thing. Computing, identifying, calculating the victim and the quantum of damage. The police will make their list, they'll make the panchnama, but is there any collaborative evidence from the media? Or is the victim's claim that my house was burnt being countered, as happened in many places in Delhi, where I live, by the media, which says, no, but this man's roof has weapons. So although his wife was killed and his house was burnt, but the fact that he had stones on top of his roof means he was the aggressor. It happened, you know. People have been arrested and are still in jail on this argument. One of them, MLA of the ruling party, no longer an MLA, no longer with the ruling party, which expelled him, but is there. So the media today, if I were to say, as distinct from 1969-70 when I began, the media today is a participant. It is not even what we would say embedded. It is a participant. It has picked up the gun.
Yeah.
It has picked up the gun. It has weaponized its instruments, its pen, its camera, its bandwidth, whatever.
So in the late 1990s, you and a number of other people went to Gujarat and wrote a number of articles that ended up getting published under the title of, I think it's Gujarat, the Laboratory of Hindutva. And I'm wondering why this term laboratory? What was going on in Gujarat at that time? That, you know, the RSS had been around for a long time. The BJP and its predecessors had been around for a long time. What was different about what was happening in Gujarat in the late 90s that sort of raised alarms with you?
The BJP had come to power in a state, and it had come to power not in a benign coalition, where it had been in power in UP and elsewhere, but in the hardcore RSS manner. Mr. Modi, when he was there, was not a politician. He had not worked his way from the panchayat to the district to the state as an MLA. He had never been a minister. He came and he was chief minister. He was an RSS man. So it was the RSS that was ruling the state for the first time in its long history. It was a dream come true. Also, as now, when you find laws which are meant against Christians, anti-conversion law has now been totally weaponized against Muslims, adding love jihad and things to it. But the core law remains the same. We discovered to our dismay for persons who were born to Christian families like I was, that things that were happening, even the slogans, and I think many political scientists gathered enough physical evidence, slogans, Aaj Isai, Kal Kasai, Aaj Kasai, Kal Isai, where Kasai, the butcher, was synonym with the entire Muslim community, and Isai meant the Christian, the padre, the nun, the small Christian family, the tribal, going to pray in a church. And that they were studying really the whole mechanism of polarization, the whole mechanism of using laws to suppress communities, that they were using the media, using written words. But let me also bring in a small factor. Back in the emergency in 1975, Mrs. Gandhi had brought in a scientific innovation called the Satellite Instructional Television Experiment, SITE, which brought TV to 64,000 villages in various parts of the country, including Gujarat, including Orissa, including Jharkhand, the tribal belts of all these areas, where part of Mrs. Gandhi's plan was to study through resident anthropologists in village and block headquarters the impact of communication on life, on the responses of people. Images and words and slogans, and the Prime Minister coming. So, and the BJP is very fast in learning, the RSS too, learning from what the Congress has done. The database, the files that were then collected, and you will discover that even till today, they're using some of the learnings of the satellite instructional television experiment in the use of social media and mass media in polarizing people, in terrorizing people, in raising brother against brother, in buying people. So that was why Gujarat then came to be called the laboratory. And we had not spoken a minute too soon, because what they learned in Gujarat, they implemented in 2007. 2002 Gujarat, 2007 Kandamal, Orissa. 2008 Kandamal, Orissa. 64,000 houses burnt. That was more than in Gujarat. 380 churches burnt. In Gujarat, more persons were killed because they were caught out in the open in villages. In Kandamal, 64,000 people were in the forests, and therefore they were alive. If they'd been caught in the villages of Ahmedabad and Baroda and elsewhere, they would have been dead. So the laboratory bench experiment and its grassroots implementation, whether it was Kandamal or Delhi or elsewhere, it was quite correctly labeled.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, it goes without saying that those experimenters are now running the whole country, despite the fact that there are still criminal cases against the Home Minister, I believe, but they've all been suspended.
No, because the Home Minister and the Prime Minister himself, they are out on what is called the clean chit, extrajudicial clean chit, really. They were never exonerated in fair trial from a crime of which they were accused of in the first instance. The entire chain of criminal justice was short-circuited. So they cannot say...
The widow of Ehsan Jaffrey is still trying to take that forward, Mrs. Zakia Jaffrey.
And her daughter, yeah. And that building where he was burnt alive. Till COVID took, I used to go there every year. That house is still there. The compound is still there. Outside the compound, there is total hubbub, as if nothing happened there.
Yeah, these are the traumas that are unsettled, and we
Yeah.
find a way to live with them. But
Yeah, because I compiled I co-edited a book, or rather I edited a book, where I wrote, but I also collected. The title of the book was Gujarat 2002, the told and retold stories. There are still untold stories there, which need to be told. And there are stories which have to be retold in the light of India's protestations, the growth of human rights, the evolution of human rights laws.
yeah, that's very important. How we see things today may not be how it was seen at the time, and it's never too late to at least put these stories out in the open in the hope that
It is never too late, you know. Like the Nazi hunters, you have to chase them till the last one is indicted. That's the one thing I take from people I don't like, the government of Tel Aviv. The criminals, the people who have waged war on minorities of any kind, they need to be hunted down and indicted in courts of law.
yeah, and not just for the sake of justice, but because of what will future generations learn. If the impunity happens now, then how
That is justice. That is justice.
That is justice.
That is the cause of justice.
John Dayal, my last question. So there you've described in some detail the journey that you've been through as a journalist, fighting for what we would now call human rights and fighting against communalism. There must be many people out there listening to this interview who would like to be the next John Dayal or maybe the next Ravish Kumar or whatever it is. So what would you say to someone who is a young journalist who is trying to sort of make a difference, facing institutions that really don't encourage that kind of thinking?
And societies that don't encourage it. Nobody gets paid for standing up to the state. You're likely to lose your job. And at some stage, you will have to face the situation, whether you want to work in a situation where you can't get out of it, and see whether you can survive speaking the truth or die in the cause. No, I would say every human being is not just a journalist, is a scientist, is a doctor. Whether you want to join Hitler in experimenting how cold a prisoner of war can be made before he dies of hypothermia. Those are great scientists also, no? Who agreed to participate in those experiments by Hitler. Or you want to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do that. But there is no journalism unless it is the cause of the truth. Otherwise, you are just a wordsmith working for a wage, working without a conscience. And a man without a conscience is not a man or a woman. That is what differentiates us. That's what raises us from, I can't say really, the animals in the field, because animals are also good things, but that's what makes us different. That is what will show us have we evolved as human beings. Not comparing us with animals. A conscience and you standing and living by your conscience will show how much your race has evolved, how much you yourself has evolved from when you were an innocent child in school, looking at a documentary which showed you how prisoners were kept in Auschwitz, how they were killed, how they were cremated, to understanding why they were made to suffer like that. Could the rest of the German middle class, the Frosts, the Frolins, the Hirschs, could they have not spoken when they heard the trains go by, the vans go by, the clatter of machine guns? After all, when you go to any of those Dachau or Auschwitz, it is not that these camps are out in the tundras. They're not even in the suburbs. Everybody can see them, the rails can be seen going into Auschwitz, and your eyes follow those twin tracks of iron. You know what was happening. You can't say you never knew. You can't say now that you don't know what Modi is up to.
Fantastic stuff. I think there's one quote that we can bring in. I think it's by Orwell, another journalist who spoke out against atrocities, who said, journalism is saying something that powerful people don't want to hear. This is a paraphrase. Journalism is saying something that powerful people do not want to hear. All the rest is stenography, right? So those embedded journalists, the people who are working for pro-government publications that openly declare proudly that they're pro-government publications or news channels or Twitter feeds or whatever it is, that is just stenography.
I would not dare try to improve on Orwell, but I could add, you must speak then. No point speaking 6 months later or a year later or writing a book after 5 years of research. Speak while the fire is yet just a flame.
Yeah. But what are we thinking about this guy Arun Shourie these days? Because he was very pro-BJP at certain points in his career, and I don't know, he's a confusing figure to me. Sometimes he's speaking out, sometimes he's not.
He also speaks out against God, but only when it impacted himself personally. But the literature that he produced as a senior journalist to a senior minister is ammunition that is being used against people who are targeted. His literature against Dalits, let me not talk about Christians or Muslims, let me talk about Dalits. His literature worshipping false gods, Ambedkar, anti-Ambedkarism, is poisonous.
Yeah,
no,
thanks.
I think it is not the Hindu concept of sin or even the Christian concept of sin. You can't wash away, go to the Ganges. You cannot say Hail Mary 5 times and be forgiven, You cannot be just contrite. How much then you go? Do you disown your past? Do you say, I am sorry I did what I was, I didn't know, or maybe I knew. I fell into the trap. I renounce my past. I denounce the old John. This is a new John, a reborn John. Listen to me now. Saul is dead. Paul is born. There are not many ways to Damascus where you can say the old is dead. Listen only to the new. The old will always haunt you.
Yeah, and Arun Shourie has not denounced any of his...
No, he won't. Because to denounce his... But that is all that he was built upon. You remove those things from him, he's just another hack like me. We went to the same college. He was a couple of years senior.
Right. There's lots more we could talk about, John Dayal, but thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to continuing the conversation sometime soon.
Thank you very much indeed. Take care.
Thanks, sir. You were listening to a Peace Vigil conversation with veteran journalist John Dayal. Samir Dosani was the interviewer. The music is by Jeremy Korodia and Shirin. The artwork is by Lal Bahadur. Do remember to like and subscribe wherever you're listening, share this podcast with your friends, and remember that peace needs all of us.